Finally, we are in period 4, 1800 to 1848, and we are now discussing Unit 8, Jefferson, Madison, and the War of 1812. Now, I also want you to realize that the year 1800 is the start of the antebellum era, just in case you come across that term in any of the readings. And the antebellum era, if you really want to just sum it up, is a time period when the South is doing extremely well. When you see these movies with the women in the beautiful dresses living on plantations, and everything is about how rich and powerful they are, in the South, that's the antebellum era. And it is divided into two time periods. Early antebellum is 1800 to 1840, and then late is 1840 to 1860. Realize that 1860 is the year that the Civil War begins. That's why the antebellum era ends there. Now let's go back and talk about the Revolution of 1800 one more time, just to make sure you understand what it was. This is the time period where the country, the United States, is going to change political parties for the very first time ever. And so, as John Adams, the Federalist, leaves the House, Thomas Jefferson, the Democratic Republican, is going to come in as the president, and the entire world expected there to be chaos and possibly even civil war, but nothing really happened. So it became known as the Revolution of 1800 because we changed political parties, but it wasn't a true revolution in the sense that people fought one another and bloodshed. And because it was a peaceful transfer of power, it showed the world that we were a united country and that we were a force to be reckoned with. So just the fact that nobody fought with anybody else was a big, big deal. Jefferson's presidency kind of sets off the idea that the Democratic Republican Party is the one that should be in power, and they stay in power for 30 years. Not that all of them are wonderful, but for that new political party to be in charge for 30 years, that is a pretty big deal. So let's take a little bit of a closer look at Jefferson himself. Now, Jefferson's vision of the best America that could ever be is pictured right here. He wanted an agrarian America. Remember, he wants the United States to be a political entity where the states have more power than the federal government. And the states he's most interested in, of course, are the southern states where the majority of the farming is taking place. And slowly it's becoming the western states as well as we expand and farm there. But overall, his dream of America, the perfect America, is an agrarian republic. So let's look at some of the things he did and decide if he really was fulfilling his goal of a country where the states had more power and it was an agrarian society. So, first, he's going to cut the size of the Army, Navy, and federal departments. He's going to get rid of jobs within those federal departments that he felt was a waste of money. And so that does show that he's trying to weaken the power of the federal government and give the states more power. He then also eliminates taxes on whiskey. Remember, that was the sin tax that Hamilton came up with to pay back our national debt. He also did away with taxes on slaves and property because, now remember, he's thinking about Southern farmers and property. Of course, you have to have that to farm, and the wealthier and larger plantations had to have slaves. There were no white individuals in the South asking for a job on a farm. You had to have slaves in order for your farm to be successful in this time period. So, slaves and property are two things that farmers have to be successful, and so he removes the tax on both. He promoted laissez-faire policies for the economy. If you remember that, that is the idea that the government should not be messing with the economy, that we should allow supply and demand to just kind of naturally do its thing in society, and that the economy would right itself, and take care of itself. And remember, that's Adam Smith, the Wealth of Nations guy, came up with this idea. He also freed anyone imprisoned by the Sedition Acts that Adams had created. Remember, the Sedition Acts said that you couldn't speak ill of the president or the government, and anybody that did would be imprisoned. And so Jefferson kind of felt like it was his fault, maybe, that some of these people were imprisoned because it was people who had talked ill about Adams and good about Jefferson in order to get him elected. So he frees them. He also allowed the charter of the National Bank to expire. He didn't cancel the National Bank, but the National Bank had a contract and that contract expired. And so he's not going to just cancel it because that would make that's too big of a deal. So he just did not re-signed the contract. He also collected taxes only through tariffs on trade. And then this money was all to be used to pay off debts. So he's not using the tax money to create anything new, and that people might be upset with. At least that was his goal. He was only going to use it to pay off debts and to put our country in a more healthy position. So he's still, all these things right here, he's still going by that strict interpretation of the Constitution. And he's still saying states should have the power. So let's see if he sticks with that. There is an event that had been going on in America since the 1790s. George was the first one really to deal with it, and it had to do with some pirates, real honest to goodness pirates that came from the Barbary Islands and over in Europe, and they were basically causing mayhem on the waters. And they were a fierce group, a really, really scary group, and so countries all over the world actually paid them bribe money not to board their ships. And America was one of those countries. So the debt kept going up every year, of course. And by 1801, Jefferson is the guy in charge. And he says, we are now giving a fifth of our money and causing a fifth of our debt to be money to those Barbary pirates. And we're not doing it anymore. So again, he's saying that you're taking money that the people have given the government and using it to bribe pirates? No way. So Jefferson sends a navy over there to defeat these Barbary pirates. And their core headquarters, the Barbary pirates, was in a little place called Tripoli that you can see on the map over here. And so they end up fighting mostly a water battle right off the shores of Tripoli, and it's a 4-year battle. And of course, in the end, we win. And the Barbary pirates are forced to sign a peace treaty. And that peace is going to last until 1815. So 1801, he starts the fight. It ends in 1805. And there is peace for 10 years. By then, he's not the president anymore. So he's kind of a hero, but he did use federal money to increase the funds for a larger Navy to get this done. So is he giving the states power, or is he using federal power? But is he using the federal power to protect those states? He's a very confusing president, and I'm sure that he felt the confusion as well. And just as a side note, if you've ever heard the Marine Corps song, one of the lines says, "From the halls of Montezuma," hopefully you all know who Montezuma is, "to the shores of Tripoli." That's the Tripoli that they're talking about. The Marines. It was the Marines that landed at Tripoli under the guidance of Thomas Jefferson. So if you don't know the Marine Corps song, look it up. It's a really neat song. So again, does the Barbary pirate event reflect an agrarian republic? You decide. He did it to protect the states, but he used federal power to do it. So, who knows? You decide on your own. Now, America was getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And by the time that Jefferson was the president, people were moving to the West more and more often. And he was worried that we were going to run out of land. He was worried about control of the Mississippi River. You guys know that we were having problems with access to the mouth of the Mississippi. And so he's got all these concerns. So he decides to send Madison to France to make a deal with the French people who now owned the territory that we called Louisiana back then, which was gigantic. Make a deal with $10 million just to buy New Orleans. That way we would have the mouth of the Mississippi under control. We would be able to keep all the warehouses there and use them freely without worrying that the French were ever going to cut us off. And so Madison is asked by Jefferson to take this deal to Napoleon and see what Napoleon says. Now, Madison is worried. He's afraid that Napoleon is going to laugh in his face about this purchase, and so he's kind of hemming and hawing. We really want New Orleans, but he's not naming a price. He's hoping that Napoleon will name a price, and Napoleon kind of got impatient with him. Napoleon needs money. He's fighting England, and he needs money, and he needs it fast. So he's thinking that the Americans are not going to give him money, and he's worried that they won't think it's a good enough deal, and Madison will just go home and tell Jefferson, it wasn't worth it, forget it. So it's Napoleon that blurts out, I will give you the Louisiana Territory for 15 million. So think about now what Madison's reaction must have been. He was going to give 10 million for just New Orleans, and suddenly Napoleon is saying 15 million for the entire Louisiana Territory, and of course, done. It's a done deal. But here's the question: does the Constitution provide for such a massive purchase? Okay, so whether it does provide for such a massive purchase or not, Jefferson is, of course, is going to be delighted with the deal, and the deal of the Louisiana Purchase at $15 million is considered the best land deal in the history of the entire world. So, of course, he couldn't turn it down. But again, you have to wonder, is it constitutional? Where in the Constitution does it give you the right to buy such a massive piece of land with the tax money you've made off of the people? But anyway, he did it, and now he's got to have somebody explore it to find out what exactly did he just buy. So he has a very good friend named Meriwether Lewis. Meriwether Lewis was willing to come and fight in the Whiskey Rebellion. And he and Jefferson had become really good friends. And when Jefferson became president, Meriwether Lewis didn't feel confident enough to really be one of the cabinet members, and but he wanted to be something. He wanted to help, and so Jefferson offered the idea of allowing Meriwether Lewis to be his personal secretary, and so Lewis accepted the position. Well, when this purchase came about, Lewis was very good at scientific discovery and mapping things out and identifying new things, and so in Jefferson's mind, there was nobody better to explore this new territory than Meriwether Lewis. And so Lewis agrees to take the job. And he has another friend by the name of William Clark. And William Clark also is very good at different plant life and animal life, and just a very good organizer. He's great at making deals, and they would have to have lots of deals here for equipment and guides and things like that. So Lewis and Clark become the two that are going to explore the Louisiana Territory. So from 1804 to 1806, they're going to walk at least 8,000 miles. That's the number that we have documented. It could be more than that, but 8,000 miles. And the little group that they took with them became known as the Corps of Discovery. So the Corps of Discovery is going to send things back to Jefferson and the White House. They have people that run back and forth between the group that's doing the exploring and the White House. And at the time, the White House was not done, and so Jefferson, when he would get all these items back from the Corps of Discovery group, he didn't really know what to do with them. But the one item he really didn't know what to do with was dinosaur bones. We didn't know what that kind of stuff was. So he just saw them as giant bones, and so he had them deliver all these bones to one of the rooms in the White House that wasn't finished yet, and it became known as the bone room. And it ends up that it was actually the room right next to what we now use as the Oval Office. So that used to store dinosaur bones. But anyway, of course, the group doesn't really know anything about the Indians that live in the Louisiana Territory, and they want to make sure that they don't end up getting killed right off the bat. And so they decide that they need to hire somebody who can talk to the Indian tribes, who is good at geography of the area. And they end up meeting this guy by the name of Toussaint Charbonneau. And Toussaint said he talked them into letting him do it, but he said, "Look, I have a young wife and she's pregnant, and I don't want to leave her alone." And her name is Sacagawea. Well, the truth of Sacagawea is that she was forced to marry Charbonneau when she was 12. She was a deal that her father had made. And so at 12 years old, against her will, she marries this man that's in his 30s. He was kind of a nasty guy, had a bad temper. So here she is now, she's 15 and she's pregnant with their first child. And she's going to be forced to go on this journey pregnant. But he tells them that he doesn't want to leave her behind. He's worried about her. The truth is that he was afraid if he left her behind, she would take off and she wouldn't be there when he came back. So he was really taking her basically as a prisoner. So a couple months go by, and Meriwether Lewis and William Clark realize that Charbonneau was full of it. He was not a good guide. He did more to make the Indian tribes angry than he did to make any deals with them. And they watched as Toussaint would go in and anger local Indian tribes, and Sacagawea would go in after her husband, and she would smooth things out, and she would get the deal done. And so finally, Lewis and Clark went to Charbonneau and said, "Look, you're out of here. We don't want you to be part of the group anymore, but we will pay you good money to keep your wife. We want to use her as our guide." And so, because there was money involved, of course, Charbonneau said yes, and he left. So Sacagawea stays with the group. The day comes that she goes into labor, and she tells Lewis and Clark, "I'm about to have the baby." And they said, "Well, we just made a deal to borrow these canoes for a limited time from this local Indian tribe, and we got to get across this river so that the tribe can get their canoes back. So the most we can give you to have this baby is 12 hours." And so Sacagawea went and sat under a tree and delivered her own baby. And 12 hours later, right, she had just delivered the baby, not even 10 hours before, they said, "Get in the boat, let's go." And according to the journals, and this is from the people who saw it, Sacagawea was getting into the boat with her brand new baby, 10 hours old, and she was trying to handle, the baby and her backpack and all these other things, and she dropped the baby as she was getting into the boat into the water. And she looks at Lewis and Clark thinking, hey, they're going to jive in and get the baby, and they didn't. So Sacagawea, just having a child, had to dive into the water and save her own baby. So it doesn't sound like this group is a very united group as far as Sacagawea and Lewis and Clark, but the story gets a little weird once they come home. So they come home. Lewis is given the position of the governor of the Louisiana Territory, and he can't handle the position. He's really, really worried about what Jefferson is going to think about him. He wants to please Jefferson. And so things aren't going really well in the Louisiana Territory. It's a giant, giant landmass. It's not unified. It's not organized. Every little thing that he tries to do, the new people living there, complain. And so he feels like he's letting Jefferson down. He feels like he's not good at his job, and he'd never had that feeling before. He thinks that the people living in the Louisiana Territory hate him. He'd never been hated before. He was always a well-liked guy. And so he has a complete breakdown, and he goes to a bar, and he gets a bottle of liquor, and he rents a room above the bar, which was a normal thing. But he's up there for a little while, and the lady who owns the bar with her husband, she's tending the bar by herself that night. Her husband is away, and she hears a gunshot. So she runs up to his room, opens the door, and there he is with this massive bloody wound in his stomach. And he yells at her, "Woman, get me some water and save me." And it scared her. So she didn't get any water or try to save him. She slammed the door and went back downstairs. So hours later, her husband finally comes to the bar, and she tells him what happened. And so he runs up to check on Lewis, and when he got there, Lewis had gotten his razor out of his shaving kit and had cut himself from head to toe. So he has these cuts everywhere and the massive stomach wound. So the husband of the bar does call the doctor. but it's too late. Lewis has injured himself beyond repair, and he dies a couple days later from the stomach wound. So he died in 1809, and you would think that would be the end of the story, but it's not. His death, there is a funeral, and Sacagawea and Clark both, of course, attend the funeral, and Clark and Sacagawea start to talk, and he and she visit with one another, not romantically at all, but with as friends. And Sacagawea's son, Jean Baptiste, the one that was born on the journey, comes with her quite often. She also had a little girl, somewhere in this time period. We don't know the name of the little girl, but she did have a second child with Charbonneau. So Sacagawea and Clark rekindle this friendship. Only friendship, again, no love interest. But Sacagawea died mysteriously in 1812, and we don't know what happened to her daughter. Her daughter disappeared too, and so did Charbonneau. So we're not really sure exactly what happened. All we know is that Sacagawea died, and Toussaint and the little girl disappear. But Clark took Jean Baptiste and legally adopted him, raised the kid, sent him to college, and acted as his father. So it just seems weird that on the journey, they weren't even going to save him when he fell in the water, but then Clark ends up adopting him. So very weird situation. But know that these three were the real core of discovery, and discovered great things and opened up the Louisiana Territory and made it seem safe for new people to come and to live there. So again, does the purchase of the Louisiana Territory and the expiration, does it go against the agrarian republic? Well, you have to ask yourself. Okay, the federal government made this massive land purchase, paid all this money for Lewis and Clark to go and explore it. So that's a federal thing, but who was going to use the land? Mostly farmers. So is he protecting and growing that agrarian republic, or is he growing that power of a federal government? Again, you could look at it from either side of the fence and you would not be wrong on either side. So Jefferson is a very confusing president. So let's look at what trade was like when Jefferson was president. So the French and the British are fighting one another. And the French are seizing ships going to British ports. The British are closing all the French ports. And of course, America is expected to take a side. And so we're not really sure what to do until an event takes place because of these two fighting and trying to steal each other's ships. And in this case involves America, and it's called the Chesapeake Incident. There was a ship, an American ship named the Chesapeake, and a British ship pulled alongside them in 1807, the Chesapeake ship, and said, I think you have British deserters on your boat. We want to board your boat, and we want to find these men, and we want to take them back for punishment. And the captain of the American ship, the Chesapeake, said, "No, we are not going to allow you to board our ship. Sorry." He was probably worried that they were going to come on board and use impressment. We've talked about that, where they would make American soldiers force them to serve in the British military, British Navy especially. So the captain of the Chesapeake, it's perfectly natural that he said no. So the British are going to fire on the Chesapeake, and they end up killing three Americans. So, of course, everybody is really, really upset with this. Congress is not in session at the time, thank goodness, because Congress probably would have declared war on Britain for this incident. Britain even admitted, hey, that what happened was wrong. We're not really sorry, but what happened was wrong. So there probably would have been a war, but Jefferson knew that we were not ready for a war, and so he felt like he had to do something to show the American people that he was not just going to let it happen, and nothing be done to counteract it. So rather than war, because we can't afford another war, he creates something called the Embargo Act of 1808, and basically it's cutting out trade with Europe. America's not allowed to trade with Europe anymore. And he thinks it's going to teach the Europeans a lesson. But what it really does is it ends up hurting American traders, and our country starts to go bankrupt. And you've got people, individual people and businesses that are filing bankruptcy because of this embargo act. So the next year, Jefferson takes an embargo act and he morphs it into another act called the Non-Intercourse Act of 1809. And rather than saying you can't trade at all with Europe, he's saying you can't trade with Britain or France. Well, this still isn't good enough because those are the two countries that we traded with the most. So it still is not enough to help the people in America that are struggling. So finally, right near the end of Jefferson's presidency, that bill is going to be morphed one more time. It's called the Makin's Bill #2, and basically, first he said that you can trade with anybody you want at your own risk. That's the first part of it. The second part is that he announced that he would lift the blockade on whichever, or lift the ban on whichever country was willing to lift the blockade on the other. So between Britain and France, whichever one of you is willing to lift that blockade of trade from the other, we will start trading with the good guy again. And of course, France immediately said, we will stop blocking British ships. Please trade with us again. So it really opened up trade with Britain and France both, because of course Britain's not going to allow France to trade with us, and they not trade with us. So it really does, it ends up ending that closing of the ports and the seizing of French and British ships. So really, Makin's Bill kind of got everybody out of hot water, but it takes a really long time for Jefferson to admit that that Embargo Act and then the Non-Intercourse Act wasn't working, that it was hurting the country. And again, you have to ask yourself, does that embargo and the depression that became out of it reflect an agrarian republic? So again, you could look at it from either side. He can't allow, he's protecting the states by not allowing foreign countries to fire on our ships, but to create this embargo and to cut off trade is definitely a federal power. So again, either side of the fence, both sides are right. You decide. So let's take a look at Madison. Jefferson's presidency is over, and his best friend, James Madison, is going to be the president. And again, he is a Democratic Republican. He was always part of politics with Jefferson. They were best friends. We've talked about this before. Don't forget that James Madison is also the father of the Constitution. He's the guy that came up with the Virginia plan to develop our government. He is the guy who took all the notes at the Constitutional Convention. So he is a very well-known man. Again, he's very good friends with Jefferson, and this is kind of a unique situation. Jefferson did not have a wife when he became president. His wife had passed away. And so it was kind of improper for him to be president without a wife, especially when it came to social events. And so because Madison and Jefferson are best friends, Jefferson goes to Madison and says, can I borrow your wife Dolly? Let's let Dolly be the person in charge of all the social events as if she were my wife. She can act in that position. And no, there was nothing going on between Dolly and Thomas. They were all really good friends. So the unique position that she is put in is that she actually acts for first lady for 4 terms, 2 under Jefferson and 2 under her own husband. And just as another aside, Madison and Jefferson were such good friends that they both ended up dying on July 4th. Haha, July 4th, our Independence Day, on the same day. It was the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence to the day. And they're going to not die together. They die in their own separate homes. And Madison's very famous last words were, Jefferson lives. And he was wrong. Jefferson actually died a few minutes before him. So they were such good friends that they ended up dying on the same day. All right, so Madison is going to become president 1808. He's going to serve for 2 terms. His wife is Dolly Madison, and we'll talk more about her in a minute. There is a group at the time period that starts to come out, and this group is known as the Warhawks, and we're going to come back to them. So make sure you know the name. But the Warhawks included two very famous men that we're going to come back to again and again. Those being Henry Clay of Kentucky and John Calhoun of South Carolina. South Carolina, South Carolina. Guess what? That's going to be really important later. So again, John Calhoun, South Carolina, Henry Clay, Kentucky. Make sure you know them both as Warhawks. You're going to need to know their names for something else later. So Madison was going to have some issues with Native Americans. So there still are a lot of Native Americans in the Ohio River Valley. We had fought hard for this, remember? So by 1794, Americans had done so many evils to the natives in the Ohio River Valley that basically they were crushed. And they were all forced to sign the Treaty of Grenville in 1795, which ended a lot of tribes' existence in the Ohio River Valley. And those that were allowed to stay were they had to basically sign away saying that they would never do anything bad, and if they did, the government could take their land or take their lives. So that Treaty of Grenville really did, it was basically set up to end the Indian threat, completely end it in the Indian territory of the Ohio River Valley, 1795. So these people were completely demoralized. Native Americans that were left to stay in the Indian territory of the Ohio River Valley had no hope. Many of them turned to alcohol as a means to be able to live with their new lives and became alcoholics. It was a really bad situation. Well, two brothers came along. They were both Shawnee, and their names were Tecumseh and the Prophet. And Tecumseh and the Prophet gave these people hope. They said, we don't have to stand for this if we band together, if we don't worry about what tribe who belongs to and just become brothers, we can fight the whites here. So Tecumseh and Prophet together organized the what was left of all the Indian tribes, and they became known as the Tecumseh Confederation. So even though Tecumseh and the Prophet were Shawnee, it didn't matter. You had all these different groups, Indian groups now, that are going to come together under that title of the Tecumseh Confederation. And so they're going to end up actually building a town for all these people. And the town is named Prophet's Town for the Prophet. And it is built near a pretty vital river at the time period called the Tippecanoe River. And so, right on the verge of the Tippecanoe River, Prophetstown grew and grew and grew. They became very prosperous. And by 1811, there was a man who had been made governor of the Indian Territory and in the Ohio River Valley, and he was pressured by whites in the area to do something about the growth of Prophetstown. The whites were feeling anxious about it. And so he is looking for a reason to go and do something to Prophetstown, but he can't quite figure out how to do it legally. And then, as luck would have it, a small group of Indians that were not even associated with Tecumseh's Confederation, they attacked a family and killed them, a white family. So, of course, Governor William Henry Harrison is going to use that as an excuse. He's going to claim that Tecumseh's people had done this. And so he goes for government help, and he gets 1,000 military men to march on Prophetstown and start a battle, which will become known as the Battle of Tippecanoe. Remember, because it's near the Tippecanoe River. Prophetstown is burned to the ground. The prophet is killed in the Battle of Tippecanoe. Really, his goal, Henry Harrison's goal, was to get Tecumseh, because Tecumseh was the real brains of the outfit. Tecumseh wasn't there that day. Just by luck, he was not there that day. He was out trying to get more people to be part of his confederation, and he was also making deals with Britain to help him if he ever needed them. So he was away making all these deals, and comes back to find out that his brother has been killed and his town has been burned down. Now, as an aside note, William Henry Harrison is he becomes a hero over this. People really did believe that Tecumseh's people needed to be shut down, that they had done this horrible murder, even though it wasn't true. And later, William Henry Harrison is going to run for president, and they're going to nickname him Tippecanoe. So you're going to hear that again. But his nickname comes from this horrible thing that he did to Tecumseh and his brother. So again, remember that they were Shawnee, created a confederation regardless of the tribe you belong to, and then the prophet is going to die at the Battle of Tippecanoe. So Tecumseh, of course, is very upset over the death of his brother and the burning of Prophetstown, and so he immediately goes to the British during the War of 1812, which we're going to come back to that war again. But here's Tecumseh's part in it. So America and the British are going to be at war in the War of 1812, and Tecumseh is going to have the unlucky decision to join with British forces. And he also convinces some Canadians to jump in on this, and they're all going to take a very strategic fort called Fort Detroit. It's an American, of course, it's on American soil. It's an American fort, and they're going to take it and kidnap 2,500 American soldiers. And America, we're not mad at Tecumseh necessarily, but we are furious with the British, and he just happens to be part of it. And so America has had it. We want the British out once and for all. And so after this capture of Fort Detroit, about a year later, we are battling against Tecumseh because he's part of the Canadians and the British forces, and they're at the Battle of Thames. He is killed. So he's killed, and again because of his partnership with the British and the Canadians. So he's killed at the Battle of Thames. His Confederation is going to completely die with him, and any forces of Indian power that were doing anything to survive in the Ohio River Valley, all of that's going to die with him. We don't see it as a loss for the poor Indians. We see it as an American victory because, again, we're focused on the British. And so the Battle of Thames was a fight where the British, the Canadian, and Tecumseh's Confederation were against us. And so when we killed Tecumseh, we weren't doing it to kill Tecumseh. He just ended up being one of the men that were sacrificed at the Battle of Thames in the name of an American victory. So remember the War Hawks that I talked about, specifically John Calhoun and Henry Clay. Um, After learning about what happened with Tippecanoe and the fact that this confederation, this Indian Confederation, was getting Canada and Britain on their side, Calhoun and Henry Clay as leaders of this Warhawks, is really going to basically attack Madison, who was trying to find a peaceful way to make the Canadians mind their own business and to take care of the Indian problem and to get the British out. He did not want war, but the Warhawks are constantly screaming. And of course, they're using the events at Tippecanoe to say, look, we had to kill Indians because the Indians are still misbehaving. They're using that as a reason to go to war because remember that the brothers were getting the British on their side too, and they were also getting the Canadians. So Tippecanoe is a reason to go to war with the British because they were helping the Indians. It also will legitimize an attack on Canada if we go to war because we want Canada's land. They have great land there, forests that have been untouched, and great farmland. They also wanted to get rid of any remnants left of the Shawnee Confederacy, just in case somebody decided to come back and rise up again, the Indians. War is always good for the economy, and our economy wasn't doing wonderful. So we wanted to have a war to better the economy. And of course, they also use the excuse that this is national honor. The Canadians are against us, the British are against us. We're being fought from within by our own Indian tribes, and look at all the great things that we've done for those Indians, and they're fighting us. And so this is a matter of national honor, and so we need to declare war on all of these people. So Madison is really feeling pressure from this very radical group within the legislature known as the Warhawks. And again, make sure you know John Calhoun and Henry Clay. So with the pressure of the Warhawks, Madison is going to declare war on Britain in June of 1812. And the sad thing is that the Britain had just gotten a brand new prime minister, and his goal was to get all the British out of America and to settle things peacefully, which was Madison's dream. But Madison declared war before the guy could get the message to the United States. So this, if he had waited just a month, we never probably would have gone to war with England the second time around. But the Warhawks really pushed Madison into it. The Federalists were totally against this war. They felt like there was not enough reasons to have a war, and so they call it Mr. Madison's War, and that is done in a not nice way. Mr. Madison's War, not American War, Mr. Madison's War. So the Federalists were really upset with Madison about this. Now, the reasons that he and the Warhawks gave were the fact that our men on the seas were still being impressed by the British, which was a huge thing. Over 5,000 men disappeared, and they were being impressed into the Navy that belonged to England. We wanted to have freedom of the seas and neutral rights on the waters, just like everybody else, so that we could trade and make money, just like Europe was making money. And of course, all the Indian issues that we were having, we felt like if the British withdrew their support from local Indians, then the issues with the Indians would die with that support. So there were good reasons. They're good reasons. They all make sense. But again, make sure you know that the Federalists never will support this war. And from beginning to end, it gets that nickname, Mr. Madison's War, in a very satirical, nasty way. So let's take a look at some of the significant events in the War of 1812. We did invade Canada, which today doesn't that sound stupid? We invaded Canada, and we weren't successful at all, but it did convince the Canadians to slowly push the British out of Canada in certain areas. So they kind of became neutral after it, even though they beat us. The Canadians beat us. So, with the British help, of course, but doesn't that sound weird that the Canadians beat us? So, it is a failed invasion of Canada, which kind of puts us on the outs with Canada. There were lots of battles with Indians, and we've already talked about the Battle of Thames with William Henry Harrison. He was actually there, and when Tecumseh was killed. So Harrison is at fault for both the death of the prophet and of Tecumseh. Remember, the brothers died two different places. The prophet died in Prophetstown, the Battle of Tippecanoe, and of course, Tecumseh will die at the Battle of Thames. And Harrison was at both, so that matters. But anyway, we also have the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. So the Battle of Thames ends that Confederacy in the Ohio River Valley and the threat of Indians there. But you had Indians in the South, especially the Creeks at the time, who were really fighting us, and they were doing it with the help of the British. And so the Creeks, being the number one group, they actually got the nickname Red Sticks, and that was just a derogatory term. But Andrew Jackson was sent down to take care of the Red Sticks, and so he battles them at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, which is it's a bloodbath. He murders everyone, innocent women and children, along with the warriors, and he becomes a hero, of course, because of it, and it ends that Creek resistance, which we will talk about later when we talk about Jackson as president and his removal of the Indians. But the Battle of Horseshoe Bend makes a name for Andrew Jackson. So everybody in this war, the War of 1812, knows who Jackson is after this battle, because it is so bloody and it is so quick. And Americans didn't see that as a terrible thing. They saw that as a really good thing. And so Jackson, for the first time, gets his name out there and becomes a national hero at the cost of the lives of Indians. Of course, one of the most significant events of the War of 1812 is the invasion and burning of our capital, D.C. Of course, it was easy to know that the British were approaching the capital, and so troops were sent to stay them off. And in Madison, as president, believe it or not, is going to go to the front lines, and he tells Dolly, get out. Make sure you get the Declaration of Independence and any other documents that you possibly can, and to protect them, and get out. And so Dolly Dolly doesn't just get the Declaration of Independence. She gets as much as she possibly can, and she sews all this stuff into her dress in case she is stopped by the enemy. Propriety of the time would not allow a British soldier to look under her skirt, and so the picture that you see of George in the background, which is a very very famous picture, she had that taken off the frame. That was rolled up. That was put under her skirt, as was the Declaration of Independence and many other of the founding documents. So she's responsible for us still being able to look at those documents today. She hid them under her skirt. So, anyway, American troops were actually in better shape than the British troops, and we had more men. The British troops had marched 15 miles in heat. Some of them had passed out. It was so hot. And you know the British, they have to have their full uniform on. And so these men got overheated and passed out. So the Americans really had one up, more than one up, on the British troops. And you would think that we would have been able to keep them out of D.C. in 1814. But the British had something called concrete rockets, and you can see a picture of it here on the screen. And these concrete rockets, they weren't super accurate, but they were scary as crud. I mean, they were rockets. So think about the difference between a cannon and a rocket. And so once they started using these, American troops really did scatter. The British troops, when they arrived in DC, they didn't really know what their goal there was. So basically, they only stayed for 24 hours, but they destroyed everything. They burned the White House down. They burned down every building that they could possibly catch on fire. They used the concrete rockets. So when they left in just a 24-hour period, they had demolished our capital to the point that there was nothing left of it. And so the White House is going to have to be rebuilt, and every other building in the Capitol as well because of the British. And just as a little aside, the White House actually wasn't called the White House in the beginning, and it was red. It was actually red. So when they rebuilt it after the War of 1812, whenever you were going to paint a building back there, you put a primer on it prior to the final coat, and they called it whitewash. Yes, I know I say wash funny. But anyway, it was white, and somebody in the crowd, supposedly, as these groups are watching people paint the this new building, somebody in the crowd supposedly said, "What a beautiful white house." And one of the designers heard this and said, "You know what? Let's keep it white." And it became known as the White House. So the War of 1812 gave us the name the White House and turned the building white. So there you go. You don't have to put that in your notes, but I always think that's interesting. Now, only a month after the burning of DC and all the buildings, including George Washington's house, was even burned down, the British are going to attack a fort, a very important fort in the Baltimore Harbor called Fort McHenry. And so this battle of Fort McHenry takes place. It takes 25 hours of that relentless bombardment of rockets and cannons and those concrete rockets, like you just wouldn't believe the stuff that they threw at the American troops hunkered down in Fort McHenry for 25 hours. And at the end of that 25-hour bombardment, the Americans refused to give up. The British were basically out of everything that they had, and the Americans said, "Nope, we're not giving up, sorry." And so the British basically skulk away in shame. But that's important enough. But in the on the outskirts of this battle was a young 35-year-old man watching. His name was Francis Scott Key. He was a lawyer, and a friend of his had been captured and taken on board one of the British ships that was going to do the bombardment of Fort McHenry, and he wanted to free his friend, and so he negotiates with the captain of the British ship and actually gets the release of his friend. But the problem is his friend and Francis Scott Key were on board when the British were discussing plans to attack Fort McHenry, and so the British can't let them go until the attack on Fort McHenry is over. And so he and his friend are forced to watch the bombardment from 8 miles away. And one of the lines in a piece of poetry that Francis Scott Key wrote after it is, it seemed as though Mother Earth had opened and was vomiting shot and shell in a sheet of fire and brimstone. So that should give you an idea of how awful it was. And because of this terrible bombardment and the bravery of the Americans unwilling to give up at the end, Francis Scott Key wrote the Star Spangled Banner. Now, one of the lines is that after the smoke cleared, he could still see the American flag flying, and that is what inspired him to write the Star Spangled Banner. That's what he said. But keep in mind, he was 8 miles away. Could he have seen the flag? So that's a question in history. He says that's why he wrote it, but it is a question in history. And I'm going to show you a picture of the flag in a minute, and maybe that will help you decide whether he could have seen it or not. It is big. It's really, really big. So 8 miles, though, I don't know. But anyway, make sure you know Francis Scott Key as the author of the Star Spangled Banner, and he did it because he was forced to watch the battle at Fort McHenry. In which the Americans still refused to give up. They stayed brave and stood their ground against the British after 25 hours of bombardment. So here is the flag, which you can go and visit in DC. You can see compared to the people how gigantic it is. I was lucky enough to actually be there when they were repairing it about 10 years ago. They took it down and laid it in this giant, giant, giant room on this huge table, and there were people all around it very carefully sewing the holes in the flag, and it really was an impressive size. Even seeing the picture here, it just doesn't do it justice to how big it is. But again, could you see it from 8 miles away? I don't know. You know how I love to destroy your historical dreams of childhood. So, but in this case, I can't tell you for sure. So I don't know. But there's the flag in all its glory. Get it? Glory, old glory. So the peace treaty between the British and the Americans is actually going to be signed on Christmas Eve in 1814, which we'll talk about the peace treaty in a minute. Word did not get out to all the people battling in different places, of course, because, there's no Google, there's no email, there's no texting. And so Andrew Jackson had a bunch of men fighting in New Orleans, and they did not know that a peace treaty had been signed even by January of 1815. So Christmas Eve, it's the 24th, so nobody got word to them, and so there is a large battle in New Orleans called the Battle of New Orleans, voila. And it is considered the last battle of the War of 1812, even though it took place after the peace treaty. So this was a group of people that you would never think could win a battle, but Andrew Jackson, can't stand the man, but he was super, super good about figuring out how to convince people to do what he wanted, whether it was through fear tactics or, being a silver-tongued devil or whatever. He could convince people to do things. And so he had this ragtag group of people, and some were militia fighters that were experienced. Some were nothing more than frontiersmen, and their only experience with a gun was hunting. They didn't, they'd never killed anybody. There were slaves that were there fighting with them, Choctaw Indians, and even pirates. There was a captain of the pirate group named Jean Lafitte, and Jean Lafitte really liked Andrew Jackson, and he really hated the British. Guess what country he's from? Lafitte? Of course, he's French. So, being that he is a French pirate, he's definitely willing to help Andrew Jackson kick the butt of some British people. So, now the British were controlled by a guy by the name of Sir Edward Pakenham, and he is actually related to Wellington, the guy who takes down Napoleon. So, there is fighting in their blood. But Jackson is he's good at trickery, and so he knows he's outnumbered, and he knows that the British militia coming towards them are better fighters. And so Jackson does something kind of crazy. He builds a wall. He builds a wall. No jokes about Trump, please. He builds a wall 7 foot tall, made of all kinds of things, a mile long, and he did it overnight. It's dark, and they of course, the British weren't expecting to come across a wall, and they bombarded the British with firing on them anything that made smoke. And so the American troops smoked up the area. So when the British came towards them, they didn't really realize what this thing in front of them was. And because there was a very small area that they could get through, like they kind of made a door in the wall, and they guided the British towards this door. And so as the British were coming through this very narrow doorway, the Americans would attack them. And so in a 30-minute time period, they had killed 2,000 British. 2,000. Only 100 Americans were killed, but 2,000 British were killed. And so, of course, in the end, Jackson is going to win the Battle of New Orleans because of the way that he did it. He was considered super brave, super smart, and Madison himself called Jackson a national savior. So, of course, this is going to skyrocket Jackson's already very popular reputation. He was already super popular for the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, where he defeated the Creeks and really put them in their place. And so, later, when he decides to run for president in the 1840s, he is going to be the guy to be reckoned with because his reputation is basically, you know, a war god because he had defeated not only these Indians that terrified everybody, but the British against all odds. So he really becomes a hero because of the Battle of New Orleans, fought after the war was over. So the treaty that I talked about to end the War of 1812 was called the Treaty of Ghent because it was signed in Ghent, Belgium. It is again signed on Christmas Eve, 1814, and basically we weren't out to really get revenge on Britain. It just restored what kind of relationship we had before, only without the blockades and things like that. So it didn't actually say anything about impressment or the blockades or neutral rights. It left all that out, even though that's the reasons really that we went to war with them. But the reason that it wasn't mentioned is because Britain wasn't at war with France anymore. They weren't at war with anybody. So why would they need to impress our men? Why would they need to set up blockades or neutral rights for trading purposes? They don't need any of that. Napoleon is not a threat anymore. Actually, today is November 4th, and this is the anniversary of the day that he abdicated and was sent to Elba to be the emperor of a little teeny tiny island. So he's not even in the picture anymore. So why would Britain impress anybody or have to set up blockades or determine neutral rights? So we started a war over something that wasn't even an issue anymore and doesn't even make it to the peace treaty. So basically, we just said in the Treaty of Ghent, hey, we're done fighting. And that was the end of that. So even though it was a 2 year war and really nothing changed politically, foreign deal kind of thing, there were some major changes because of it. So we saw that, Americans saw that as our second war for American independence. It's going to unite us. It definitely changes Indian relations because they don't have the British helping them anymore. The British actually do leave. All the forts are burned down and they do leave. So the Indians are not going to resist for a really long time, and we'll talk about that later. More and more Americans decided to migrate to Florida. It's still in control of the Spanish, but we felt like nobody was going to tell us what to do. And so there's good land in Florida. And even though it's owned by the Spanish, we're going to move there if we want to. So we had a whole new, like, come get me kind of attitude because I'll take you down. So very different America. Also, and this is, probably Jefferson was rolling over in his grave when he realized this, but we decided as a country that we had to be self-sufficient just in case there was ever another war with one of the major superpowers, and you can't be completely self-sufficient as an agrarian society. So agrarian, hey, the farmers can grow our food, but we need to be completely self-sufficient where we can make everything that we need, not just food. And so finally we say we can't be an agrarian society. We needed to depend more on manufacturing. And so that's going to change the mentality of our country as well. Andrew Jackson becomes a political hero, and we'll talk more about that in the next unit. We really did feel a new sense of pride in being an American. Napoleon had taught us that. Napoleon is the guy who came up with the idea of nationalism and love of country, and even though by the end of the war he's gone, that idea of nationalism became an international idea. And so, for the first time, we are feeling a sense of pride in being an American. And we were united politically in the idea that the majority felt like Britain is out of our hair, but we need to prepare for the future. And so, that idea that Jefferson had, his idea of an agrarian republic, is going to go by the wayside. And there's a consensus in America. This is important too. We did decide after the War of 1812 that we would share the Oregon Territory with Britain just to prevent any future fights. Both of us wanted it. Nobody wanted to be the bad guy and start another war, and didn't want it to make a big deal of this. So the Oregon Territory was shared between the United States and Britain, and that's going to matter later. So make sure that you remember it. So the War of 1812, Mr. Madison's War, was it for nothing? I don't know. Look at the changes. The big one being that maybe this is the thing that made us see ourselves as Americans and not just Virginians or West Virginians or North Carolinians. We became Americans, and that's pretty daggone significant. So I can't say that the War of 1812 was for no reason whatsoever. There were a lot of really good things that came out of it. Jackson being a hero was not one of them. You'll learn very shortly that he's not one of my most favorite men in history, but that's another story. So thanks for listening. See you soon.